Finally, the Supreme Court appears ready to stand up to Donald Trump and act as a check and balance on his power. Now, if you didn't know, today in the Supreme Court, they heard oral arguments on whether or not Donald Trump can unilaterally impose tariffs by simply declaring an emergency. And it went so bad for Donald Trump's side that conservative Justice Gorsuch actually called the thing a ratchet. Take a listen.
Congress, as a practical matter, can't get this power back once it's handed it over to the president. It's a one-way ratchet toward the gradual but continual accretion of power.
Yeah, if we give this power to Donald Trump, then Congress can never get it back, because if they try to pass a law, then the president can simply veto it. This was not a good day for Donald Trump in the Supreme Court, and this has been one of the key pieces of his administration. Even though it's hurting America, he is so proud of the tariffs, and it appears he's about to lose that power, and he is going to absolutely lose his mind and wholly catch up on the walls.
Okay, if the Supreme Court overturns the tariff, I will believe in miracles again. My cold, dead black heart will grow 10 sizes. There is a solid chance that the Supreme Court will decide that Trump's worldwide trade war is unconstitutional. It is possible, you guys. There's a significant possibility. And if that happens, utter hell will break loose. It may actually just kill him on the spot. This is happening right now, by the way. I feel like we're having a very consequential beginning to November. This feels like an intense month to me. And I can absolutely promise you, as Trump is saying, this is one of the most important cases in the history of our country. Talk about shitting your pants. We know he wears diapers. It is flowing today. And by it, I mean the shit in Trump's pants. Okay, but this is so much crazier, and it's not great. If the tariffs are invalidated, the U.S. government could owe tens of billions of dollars of refunds to businesses that have paid them. Such an outcome could also eliminate a primary bargaining chip that Trump has used in negotiations with other countries. Honestly, this is a big fucking deal. All right, everybody, go outside, cross your legs, stand on your head, do a rain dance. Do black magic. Do whatever you have to do. We got to push this one through. One more time.
The Supreme Court is hearing really important oral arguments this morning about Donald Trump's imposition of sweeping global tariffs back on Liberation Day and the massive impact they've had on consumers in our country. And I'm here to help you break that down. My name is Austin. I'm a political commentator here on TikTok. And if you, like me, do not like what's happening in this country today, make sure you drop a follow so we can keep talking about it. The IEEPA, the International Economic Emergencies Power Act, was passed by Congress in 1977 and granted the executive a lot of authority to make sweeping economic decisions, mostly around sanctions in times of national crisis. Because the Constitution does not do a good job laying out what should be done when emergencies strike, and you can't go through normal mechanisms. But Donald Trump has used this as an argument to impose tariffs. Now, there's two really important things to understand that are being picked apart as we speak in these oral arguments. Number one, tariffs are effectively a consumer tax. We understand that when tariffs are imposed, it is ultimately American citizens that pay that tax through increased prices. It is effectively imposing a tax on your people. But Donald Trump's lawyers and everyone that is arguing for tariffs is desperate to avoid that classification. They don't want tariffs to be referred to as a tax or even understood as a tax on the American people, because he does not have that authority. That legal case falls apart when a tariff is referred to as a tax. So they're going to be dancing around that a lot and have already tried really, really hard this morning in the arguments to avoid that classification. The second thing is justices, like myself, seem really skeptical about what underlying emergency allowed him to invoke this act in the first place. And I do think that these tariffs are ultimately doomed to fail. But we also live in unprecedented times, and this Supreme Court has handed some pretty big victories to Donald Trump in the recent past. So who really knows what will ultimately happen? But we got to keep watching it. It is a very big deal.
All of United States Supreme Court oral arguments in the air. It's the fall. It's the new term. And it's a landmark oral argument today in about 2 hours in front of the United States Supreme Court. about the entire framework of Donald Trump's presidency. No, not the lawlessness. No, not the depravity. No, not the immorality. That's for another day. But on the surface, the framework of his domestic and foreign policy, of his economic policy, are tariffs. And the fundamental question, because you'd think it would have already been answered before Donald Trump decided to impose tariffs on, as one federal court put it, tariffs of unlimited duration on all goods on virtually every country. You'd think he'd have the logistics of the legality worked out. But he relied on the slender shoulders of one law, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act from 1977, from Donald Trump's favorite president. Say it with me, Jimmy Carter. And that law was passed by Congress in order to rein in a president who was struggling and gurgling under the weight of a collapsing economy, and they didn't want him to do certain things. So they gave him limited powers in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. Now, Donald Trump has distorted the true meaning of the statute of IEEPA and its powers and its uses, has tried to turn limitations into some sort of affirmative power. And now it's made its way up to the United States Supreme Court. Yes, the day is here for this landmark oral argument. And I'm going to be looking for several things. I wanted to make this sort of a primer for you to guide you, a viewing guide, if you will, for what's coming up in about 2 hours at 10 a.m. We'll be doing a live feed, live stream under the live tab of Legal AF YouTube channel about it. And then we'll come on with commentary. I'm going to be joined afterwards by Legal AF contributors Lisa Graves, who's written in a tremendous book about the Roberts Supreme Court called Without Precedent, sort of a tip of a hat to our unprecedented, and Adam Klasfeld of All Rise News. But let's get.
So the Supreme Court really has to pick a side today. It can't really sit on the sidelines anymore between the president and Congress. And really what's happening is they're going to have to decide how far the president could go when declaring an emergency. There's a case before it called Learning Resources v. Trump, where they're really challenging the president's ability to declare unilateral tariffs. The reason this is important is Congress is supposed to levy tax and tariffs, and the president does not typically have that authority, although he can do so in the case of an economic emergency. So the president's been using this economic emergency rationale to be able to levy tariffs, and now that's being challenged. That challenge has worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And now we're really about to find out, is this court actually a third branch of government, or is it going to side with the administration again? The problem is, we continue to have a short-sighted approach to executive power, because if they say, oh, the president can declare an emergency without any sort of check and balance on what that emergency is, then is a protest an emergency? Is immigration a national emergency? There has to be some reasonable, approach to this idea of an emergency economic power. And just a friendly reminder, Congress could step in at any time and say, and be very clear that there's not an emergency with a vote, but now the case has moved its way up to the Supreme Court. And this particular court, Roberts Court, really likes this idea of, executive power, the unitary executive with all their power. But this is a very clear example of whether the president is overstepping his bounds in holding, and utilizing these powers when it comes to Congress. And, not for anything, this is really an example of when we're going to see where is the Supreme Court. And essentially, they're going to have to pick between themselves or the president, the court or the president. Their legitimacy as a check on that power, which is quite clear, or the presidential power. I want to be optimistic here, but I guess we'll find out.
Hey, what's up, America? Donald Trump's tariffs may be challenged because of the Supreme Court. So as you know, Donald Trump has been using tariffs very effectively for negotiations worldwide, up to and including putting a minimum 10% tariff on all of our trade partners worldwide, and some even as high as 100% China. But now the Supreme Court is poised to step in, possibly saying that Donald Trump's use of tariffs may be illegal. And if that's the case, that'll take a great deal of leverage with negotiation away from Donald Trump. However, it may bring prices down, but only negligibly in the short term. So the involvement of the Supreme Court with tariffs is a very rare situation happening back in the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, and again once in the 1970s. Other than that, unless I'm mistaken, I don't believe that's been done very much by the Supreme Court. Usually tariffs are something that's just kind of open for the president to do if he feels necessary. But in this particular case, Donald Trump's tariffs are being challenged right now, and the Supreme Court is not looking favorable upon Donald Trump's tariffs. So let me know in the comments if you believe the tariffs are good or bad. But one way or another, whether you support it or you're against it, it looks like the Supreme Court is starting to slip in against Donald Trump's tariffs and not in favor of them.
So it's Wednesday, November 5th, just after 12 o'clock Eastern time here in Washington. Not at the White House today, right outside the Supreme Court, because the Trump administration has a big case before the court being argued today. It has to do with whether or not all the tariffs President Donald Trump has imposed throughout his second term are legal and can stay in place. The Trump administration, of course, argues yes, and that the president properly invoked what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEEPA, but that has been at question as the justices in the building behind me have been hearing arguments from the Solicitor General, who is the attorney representing the Trump administration, and then a collection of small businesses and states that have sued the Trump administration to stop the tariffs. All of this boils down to whether or not the president stepped on Congress's toes, because Congress has the power of the purse. That means they also have the power of taxation. And tariffs, according to most economists, are a tax, because if you order a product from overseas and it gets shipped to the United States, there is a tariff charged at the port of entry that usually the consumer or the business receiving it have to pay for, unless the company that assembled it and sent it over pays it ahead of time, but that usually doesn't happen. So the Trump administration has been arguing that the president was correct in invoking that law that I just mentioned, IEEPA, under the grounds that there is a national emergency that the U.S. is responding to because of unfair trade practices from dozens of countries, and that because of that national emergency, according to the Trump administration, the president is allowed to impose tariffs on an emergency basis against any country that he sees fit. What the people and the organizations suing the Trump administration are arguing is that the president should be going through Congress to get those tariffs formally approved, because there isn't an emergency like a war going on against the U.S. So that's at the crux of this issue. At stake, of course, is basically a giant economic story that we've been talking about for months. The president has unveiled dozens of tariffs, gone back and forth with implementing them, pausing them, raising the rates, lowering the rates. There have been a list of lawsuits, and there have been a bunch of lower courts who have ruled against the administration, but they have appealed it up to here, the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court will decide whether or not the president has to go through Congress to impose all these tariffs, or whether or not he can't. I spoke with a law professor from Duke University who studies international trade law, and he pointed out something very interesting, that even if the justices end up ruling against the Trump administration in this case, even though President Trump has said over and over again that he considers this to be the most important case and that the stakes couldn't be higher because he views tariffs as a negotiating tool and as a national security matter, this trade law expert told me that even if the justices rule against the administration, the president will still be able to impose a lot of tariffs, just in a more narrow way. Here's what he told me.
I'll also say that the president has a lot of statutory authority in other statutes to impose tariffs. And so ultimately, if the government loses this case, the president is still going to be able to impose lots of tariffs under lots of other laws, including the laws he used during his first term in office. And I do think that for the conservative justices, that makes it easier to rule against the government here.
So it's going to be a while before we hear how the justices decide to rule on this case. Today was just the arguments day, but as that professor just pointed out, tariffs are not going to go away. Even if the president wins this case, he'll of course get to continue imposing them the way that he has, but if he loses this case, he'll still be able to impose tariffs just in a more targeted way, in a narrower way, but that's going to mean that small businesses and consumers like you and me are still going to have to deal with the economic ramifications of it. I highly recommend you could go on the Supreme Court's website and and listen to these arguments playing out. There are no cameras in the court, but there is audio. That's something that changed during the coronavirus pandemic. So you can go back and listen to the several hours of arguments that have played out to get the Trump administration side, to get the side of the states and small businesses that are suing the Trump administration, and to hear the questioning from the justices. The current makeup of the court is 6 conservatives and 3 liberals, but during the Trump administration's portions of arguments, there were some pretty tough questions from the conservative justices for the Trump administration, so that's something that stood out. But this will have a big impact on the economy and on President Trump's economic agenda, so it's going to be really interesting to see how the justices end up ruling.
Breaking news, Trump's case at the Supreme Court is not going well. It's not going well for him, to be honest. So a quick refresher, Trump is having oral arguments at the Supreme Court to defend his tariffs, which I delved into in a previous video. His lawyers are arguing that he has unlimited power to do this. He can call an emergency on basically anywhere, on any country for anything. But the opposition is saying, no, he can't do that. The opposition, by the way, is just businesses and a couple of states that are suing him. It's not going well for him. Apparently, even the conservative judges are leaning towards making him lose this case, ruling against him. Apparently, 7 of the justices are keen to strike this down. Now, we won't know the ruling until June. That's the latest when they can put this ruling. It might come sooner than that, to be honest. Anytime in the next couple of months or something. But June is the latest that they can give a ruling on this case, apparently. That's what I heard. In the meanwhile, Trump's chances of winning have plummeted on prediction markets. On a body market, as far as what I could see this afternoon, the rate is below 30% that he's going to win this. I should remind you, if he loses this, he loses the only toolkit in his toolbox. He loses the only tool he has. All right? There's nothing else he can lean on to bully countries. Well, an invasion, I guess, is the only thing left. Like, he could invade a country, but he cannot slap tariffs on anyone and everyone for any sort of reason if he loses this case. So fingers crossed for Canada and for the rest of the world that he does.
I don't want to sell hopium, but I think the Supreme Court is going to rule against Trump, against the government. Listening to the oral arguments and some of the arguments that have been made, they went with a really good tactic, which is fear. Yeah. Fear. That another president could use environmental policy to declare an emergency and levy huge taxes against corporations that are polluting and that can afford it, which is a big fear for the people who are super right, because they don't want that, right? It's okay if you tax us to death, but not the corporations. How would Justice Thomas get another motorhome? Another one that they used was that if they didn't give this power back to Congress, it may be gone forever, which good fear tactic. And every time Thomas or Alito would question it about like presidential powers, and say, for example, well, what happens if China, kidnaps one of our people and we need to use tariffs to try to get them back? Cato would be like, well, it's just a tax on us. So why would we raise money on ourselves? What? How does that work? So literally almost every single argument that was made by Alito or Thomas or Kavanaugh even was shot down. And Gorush was on our side. And I felt pretty optimistic after hearing what they were arguing, because there's really no argument for it. Giving the power to one person. They even brought up, this has only happened twice, and both times after it happened, Congress had to ratify it with Nixon, as in with Lincoln, to hold the power of the purse, which we've all known. So I don't want to be, overly optimistic, but Also FinTwitter's got it at Trump only having 22% chance. So the people that are betting are saying, it's not looking good. Man, those refunds are going to be a bitch to give out, though. Glad I'm not on that side.
Okay, guys. We are doing it. Mississippi flipped 2 seats, guys. A deep red state. Missouri flipped seats, guys. Ohio said forget it. Okay? Virginia, governor, lieutenant governor, AG, Democratic down the road. Louisiana, Democratic mayor. In New Orleans, Proposition 50. Guys, Fetterman is having a hard time getting the funding to run to keep his seat. I want you guys to know what's coming down the pipe. Today, the Supreme Court looks like they're going to overturn Trump's tariffs. Now, with all that being said, Trump threw a volley at us by trying to starve the American people, right? And y'all know me, I draw the line at kids. Like, you don't try to starve children, right? So I want you guys, and I keep saying this, you keep in your memory, black people, that he rolled back the federal act on discrimination. Remember, he rolled that back federally. Remember that they're trying to take our voting rights, that it's before the Supreme Court right now, to be ruled on in June or July, right before the midterms. Okay? Y'all remember that. Y'all remember how these deportations without due process. You remember that. You remember that he cut Medicaid, $850 billion. Remember he cut Medicare, $500 billion. Remember that he said he would not take off the board cutting Social Security. Y'all remember these things, right? Because when he tries to do something good for you, you remember what he's capable of. So right now, the Supreme Court, because they know we're coming for them too now, they are trying to say, it looks like they're going to overturn his tariffs, guys. It looks like they're going to declare his tariffs are unconstitutional and he reached too far. So we're going to see what it's going to be like at the end of the day. But I'm telling you, they know, everybody knows now. Let me tell you what he did wrong. He spent the money. He spent the money and he threatened to starve 42 million people. Y'all remember that.
If you want the Epstein files out and are not familiar with Michael Wolff, you need to get familiar with him. He is an author and a journalist, and he spent much of his time interviewing Jeffrey Epstein in person up until Epstein's arrest and ultimate demise in prison. So he's got a lot of information about what was going on there, the files, and everyone involved. And he wants to talk about it. And he was starting to talk about the nature of the relationship between Trump, Melania, and Jeffrey Epstein, and how specifically Trump and Melania originally met. And once they saw this, Melania Trump threatened to sue Michael Wolff. She never did, though. But by doing so, she violated New York's anti-defamation laws to kill a story that he was going to put out. And you can't do that in that state. So Michael Wolff, in a turn of events, went and sued Melania Trump. Now, this lawsuit is going to be very expensive, and he needs help. So I've put a link to his GoFundMe fundraiser to help with the legal fees to pursue this on my link tree in my bio. So go there, donate anything you can, because this is just another way to get more information released on the Epstein files. And why this is so important and so huge is by filing this suit, Michael Wolff will be able to compel both Trump and Melania to be deposed and answer questions about the nature of their relationship with Epstein and how they met, and either confirm or deny what Michael Wolff is saying and what he was told by Jeffrey Epstein. So guys, this is huge. This could be like one of the most important things that could happen regarding all of this. So go to the link tree in my bio, go click on the GoFundMe fundraiser for Michael Wolff and give anything that you can, no matter what it is, and share this and spread the word, because this is just one more chip that we can chip away at the Epstein files and get more information. Let me know what you think about this. Comment, like, share, spread the word, follow, subscribe, and I'll see you back here for the 411.